So Democrats say the president has ripped a page right out of the mob's playbook, using intimidation and unsubstantiated allegations to try to scare Michael Cohen into postponing his congressional testimony. Cohen's lawyer would cite those ongoing threats to Cohen's family as the reason for his decision. But all indications are he's referring to statements made by both the president and his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, in which they suggest Cohen's father-in-law is a criminal who should be under investigation.
He should give information maybe on his father-in-law, because that's the one that people want to look at, because where does that money? That's the money in the family. And I guess he didn't want to talk about his father-in-law. He's trying to get his sentence reduced.
His father-in-law is a Ukrainian. His father-in-law has millions and millions. Of course it's not. I'm telling you, it comes from the Ukraine. The reason that's important is he may have ties to something called organized crime.
And in one tweet, the president insinuated Cohen's wife might be involved in something illegal. Let me just pull back the curtain here a bit. We actually agonized over whether to even show you that Rudy Giuliani soundbite, because he is bringing up unsubstantiated allegations against somebody who has no evidence, and he's being investigated for a crime. And let's make that very clear. Giuliani provided no evidence. President Trump provided no evidence. But the president is not backing down.
Michael Cohen's testimony, he says he's been threatened by you and Mr. Giuliani. He and his family have been threatened.
No, I would say he's been threatened by the truth. He's only been threatened by the truth.
Okay, so what happens now? Michael Cohen has 41 days before he starts his 3-year prison sentence. That is not exactly a big window, right? But the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee says he is not giving up on trying to get Cohen's testimony.
I guarantee you, as sure as night becomes day and day becomes night, that we will hear from Mr. Cohen, period. I have not decided exactly how we will go about it, but I promise you, we will hear from him.
Ken Dilanian covers intelligence and national security for NBC News. Matt Miller is a former chief spokesperson for the Justice Department, currently an MSNBC justice and security analyst. Hoo boy, gang. So, a lot to get to here. Let me play you with Lanny Davis, who was formerly Cohen's lawyer, now kind of an advisor, had to say just this morning about all of this.
Let me be very clear. The House of Representatives now has an obligation. A resolution of censure when the President of the United States indisputably intimidates and obstructs justice to prevent a witness from testifying is an order. So is a federal criminal investigation of Rudy Giuliani for witness tampering, calling out a man's father-in-law and wife in order to intimidate the witness is not fair game.
Legal perspective, Matt, what constitutes witness tampering, witness intimidation?
It would be trying to corruptly prevent someone from testifying or providing evidence in an ongoing proceeding, which, of course, this is. I think it's pretty clear. So this is that? Yeah, it absolutely is. I think it's pretty clear what the president was trying to do. He was out publicly threatening him, publicly encouraging people to dig into his family's past. And remember, it's not just the explicit threat that the president was making, the explicit encouragement for reporters, and he even said investigators and prosecutors to dig into him. But he controls the Justice Department. He's the head of the executive branch. If he wanted to suggest to the Attorney General, you know, you ought to look at Michael Cohen's father-in-law, he has every ability to do that. And the potentially incoming Attorney General, Bill Barr, said in a quote to the New York Times that came up at his confirmation hearing, there's nothing inherently wrong with the president suggesting an investigation. So if you're Michael Cohen, these are, you can see these as real threats, both about people digging into your father-in-law's past, digging into your family, and potentially the full weight of the federal government in the terms of the Justice Department coming down on you.
This is a really interesting dynamic because most congressional investigators I've spoken to agree with what Lanny Davis said. They believe the president is engaged in despicable behavior, witness intimidation, but they're also not convinced that that's the reason that Michael Cohen has postponed his testimony.
Interesting.
They're fully prepared to subpoena him. He's already testified before the Congress, so he may have waived his Fifth Amendment rights to not speak. He's lied to the Congress, and they want to hear from him. And this may be part of a legal strategy on his part. He faces some peril in speaking under oath to the Congress because if he lies again, he's subject to criminal penalties.
So Elijah Cummings told our team, and you heard him there, basically saying, yes, you will hear from him one way or the other. Stephen Lynch, somebody else who is a member of that committee, said, yeah, we are going to subpoena him. We are likely going to subpoena him. Once he's in prison, they can do that, right?
They could subpoena him. It would be up to the Bureau of Prisons to decide whether to let him leave to come testify either in a private interview or a public interview. You would think typically the Bureau of Prisons would defer to that. But again, that's an arm of the federal government that the president controls. The president could block his testimony by ordering the Bureau of Prisons to refuse to release him. I think Ken is onto something about why he's not testifying here. I'm sure the threats and the intimidation have something to do with it. But also, I'm not sure they fully thought through this testimony when they agreed to it. He was going to come before this committee. He can't talk about the Mueller investigation. Right. He can't talk about the SDNY investigation. So he can't answer any of the questions that Democrats want to ask him. And he's just going to sit there and get beaten up by Republicans. So what was the point of it for him?
Well, one point was to tell stories about how Donald Trump behaves behind the scenes in a very unflattering way.
The dirty deeds.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
But some members of Congress would demand for him to talk about Russia. He's already spoken about Russia before the Congress. So what would be his reason for holding back now?
So what is the legal... So Matt, you've said now, and just to be clear, that you believe that what the president and Rudy Giuliani have done is, in your legal view, witness tampering, witness intimidation. Obviously, the president's view is not. He says Michael Cohen is only threatened by the truth. But what would the legal liability be for the president and Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani if you're correct?
So this is the problem with all of the president's behavior. I think the reason he acts with impunity and he feels free to go and tamper with an ongoing investigation like this and intimidate witnesses is because he knows there is no consequence.
So there's no liability for him. Right.
Well, no, here's the thing. As long as the Justice Department opinion is that a sitting president can't be indicted, and as long as there are 20 Republican senators in the Senate who wouldn't vote to impeach him, I think he feels like he can get away with doing this type of thing, because anyone else, if the minute they sent their first tweet, their lawyers would be into them and say, "You are playing with fire here. You are asking to be indicted by the Justice Department. Stop it." Instead, he's doing it again, over and over and over, because I think he thinks he can get away with it.
And we need to look no further than Paul Manafort, who was charged with witness tampering merely for repeating lies to witnesses during a pending investigation. He didn't instruct anyone to lie. He just said, "This is my story," and he was charged with witness tampering.
And speaking of Paul Manafort, of course, his court filing now that just came out said this idea that he lied is unfair, right?
Yes, but it was redacted to such an extent that you can't even understand what his argument is. He's going to appear in court tomorrow, however, to hash all this out.
So you know what that means for you. We'll see you here tomorrow, my friend. Yeah, on this program.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.